Millionaire abandoned his wheelchair-bound wife on a road and years later saw her on TV. "Alexander, why are we stopping here?" Emily's voice trembled as the luxury car glided onto the shoulder of an empty road on the outskirts of Springfield. Her heart raced at the sight of her husband, letting out an impatient sigh, exiting the vehicle without responding. The silence inside the car was suffocating, as vast as the empty stretch of road before her. Emily stared out the window, trying to comprehend what was happening. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. There was nothing here. No houses, no gas stations, no other vehicles. Just the sound of the wind blowing dust and dry leaves across the asphalt. "Alexander," she insisted, her voice louder now. Outside, he was already walking toward the trunk. His expression remained cold, determined, as if he were completing some inevitable task. Emily's stomach twisted as she saw him open the compartment and pull out her wheelchair. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing?" Panic flooded her voice, immediate and uncontrollable. Alexander didn't respond right away. He simply lifted the chair and placed it on the ground with the precision of someone discarding something useless. Then he grabbed a medium-sized suitcase and set it beside the chair. In that moment, Emily understood. "No," a whisper escaped her lips. "No, you can't be serious." She tried to open the door, but her trembling hands couldn't unbuckle her seatbelt quickly enough. The reality hadn't fully sunk in yet, but something inside her was already screaming, begging her to do something. Alexander then circled the car, opened the passenger door, and looked at her. His eyes were empty. There was no anger, no sadness, no remorse, just weariness and indifference. "I can't carry this weight anymore, Emily." Those words cut through the air like sharp blades. The shock was instantaneous. Emily felt her entire body shudder. "What? What are you saying?" She reached for his arm, her fingers gripping the sleeve of his expensive suit. Alexander froze for a moment, as though he felt her touch, but then he pulled her hand away with a swift motion. "I tried, Emily." His voice was low, almost exhausted. "I tried to be a good husband. I tried to take care of you, but I can't anymore. This is destroying me." Emily felt a wave of despair rising in her throat. "Destroying you?" The pain and disbelief in her voice made it impossible to hold back the tears that began to well up in her eyes. "I'm your wife, Alexander. How can you just leave me here?" Alexander looked away. His face remained impassive, but the slight tightening of his jaw indicated he didn't like hearing those words. "I need to move on." Emily let out a bitter laugh, mixed with sobs. "Move on?" Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she struggled to catch her breath. "And me? What do I do here in the middle of nowhere? Are you abandoning me like I'm some burden?" Alexander took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, his gaze had turned cold once more. "I've transferred money to your account. You'll be fine." Emily felt her blood boil. "Money? You think money solves this?" Her scream echoed on the empty road, but Alexander remained unmoving. Then, without saying another word, he turned away and closed the car door. Emily tried to open the handle, but it was too late. The roar of the engine reviving filled her ears like a deafening growl. "Alexander!" She slammed her fist against the window. "Alexander, for God's sake!" He didn't look back. With a firm movement, he shifted the gear and accelerated. The car sped off, kicking up dust as it quickly disappeared down the road. Emily sat there in the passenger seat, stunned, watching the taillights of the car fade into two red dots on the horizon until they vanished entirely. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Her chest heaved uncontrollably. Tears fell freely as her hands, trembling, unbuckled her seatbelt and reached for her wheelchair on the ground. But when she tried to move, she felt the brutal impact of reality. The rough, uneven road made any movement nearly impossible. She was alone. The night fell quickly, draping the empty road in a blanket of darkness. The wind howled through the trees, kicking up dust and dry leaves. Emily, motionless in her wheelchair, felt the cold seep through her skin, cutting through the thin fabric of her blouse. Her eyes, still red and swollen from the tears she couldn't shed anymore, fixated on the distant horizon. Time seemed to stand still. Her body shivered, not just from the cold, but from the shock. Her mind refused to accept the reality, desperately trying to find a logical explanation for what had just happened. Had Alexander really left her here? As if she meant nothing? As if the years they had spent together had meant nothing at all? Emily bit her lip, holding back a sob. The utter silence around her terrified her. No cars passed by, no signs of civilization. Only the darkness and the sound of the wind. Then, in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared on the road. The flickering light cut through the darkness, and for a brief moment, Emily's heart raced. Was it Alexander coming back? Or someone who might hurt her even more? Fear gripped her, making her hold her breath. But as the vehicle drew closer, she saw that it was an old truck with a faded blue cargo bed and yellowing headlights. The engine hummed unevenly, as if it was carrying more weight than it should. The truck slowed, and when it saw her, it braked sharply just a few feet away. The door creaked open, and a man quickly stepped out. He was tall, with brown hair streaked with gray at the temples, his skin weathered by the sun. He wore a worn cotton shirt and dusty jeans. His steps were firm, but it was his eyes Emily noticed first. That caught her attention. There was no pity, no suspicion, only genuine concern. "Dios santo," he murmured, crouching beside her. "Are you okay? What happened?" His voice was deep but held a softness that made Emily want to collapse right there. She tried to speak, but her throat felt tight. She barely knew where to begin. Her chest rose and fell uncontrollably, and unable to hold back any longer, a sob escaped her. "My husband." Her voice was weak, broken. "He left me here." The man frowned, and his expression subtly shifted. It wasn't just surprise, it was quiet indignation. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady the shaking in her hands. "He just left me here alone." She swallowed hard, feeling the lump in her throat grow. The man, however, didn't interrupt her. He simply stood there, listening, allowing her to release what she could. For a moment, the silence returned, heavier than before. Then, without a second thought, he stood up. "My name is Ethan Johnson," he said, "and I won't leave you here." Emily's heart leapt. Ethan crouched again, and with careful hands slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. Before she could protest, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. His touch was warm, protective, yet never invasive. He carried her to the truck and opened the passenger door. "I'll get you inside first, then I'll get your wheelchair, okay?" Emily nodded silently, too exhausted to argue. She was too tired to fight the unexpected kindness of this stranger. He placed her gently in the truck and with the same quiet efficiency, grabbed the wheelchair, folding it and placing it carefully in the bed of the truck. Then he took the suitcase left behind on the ground and placed it next to the chair. When he climbed into the truck, Ethan turned the key and the engine rumbled to life again. "We're heading to my place," he said, adjusting the rearview mirror. "You need to rest and eat something." Emily glanced out the window. The asphalt passed by quickly, and the barren landscape disappeared behind them. Despite the terror still lingering inside her, a small part of her felt something unexpected: relief. The journey to Springfield was made in silence. Ethan drove at a calm pace, respecting her rhythm, never forcing her to speak more than she wanted. When they arrived, Emily looked around. Ethan's house was small, with simple walls and a wooden porch, but there was something there that Emily hadn't seen in a long time: life. Unlike the cold, sterile apartment she'd shared with Alexander, everything here felt warm. An improvised garden stretched along the side of the house, and a soft light spilled from the kitchen window. Ethan stepped out first, grabbed the wheelchair, and with the same patience as before, helped Emily settle into it. "Come on in," he said, opening the door for her. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold. The interior of the house was modest but cozy. The scent of wood mixed with spices filled the air. In the small kitchen, Ethan lit the stove and took out a pot. "I'm making sopa de fideos," he said. "It's simple, but it's real food." Emily watched as he worked, moving with ease, never making a fuss about the situation he'd found her in. There were no invasive questions, no pitying looks, just a man willing to help without expecting anything in return. When the dish was ready, he placed the bowl in front of her. Emily took the spoon, but before tasting it, she looked up at him. Ethan smiled. "Eat. You need to regain your strength." She lifted the spoon to her mouth, and as the warm broth slid down her throat, she realized she couldn't remember the last time something so simple had felt so comforting. When she met Ethan's gaze again, she saw something Alexander had never offered her: genuine empathy. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Ethan helped Emily settle into the small bedroom he had prepared for her. It was simple but clean and inviting. A wooden bed with freshly washed sheets, a modest wardrobe, and a window that let in the night breeze. A small lamp cast a soft glow, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Emily glanced around without truly seeing. She was still in shock. Everything that had happened in the last few hours felt like a blur. The dark road, the sound of Alexander's engine fading into the night, the dust settling around her, the crushing loneliness. And now, she was here, in the home of a stranger who hadn't hesitated to help her. "You need to rest," Ethan said gently, his voice calm. "We'll talk tomorrow, all right?" She nodded slowly. Words were hard to come by. He hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Emily remained sitting on the bed, unsure of what to do next. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on her breathing, but the anxiety clung to her, as if it were stuck under her skin, refusing to leave. She slowly lay down, feeling the softness of the mattress beneath her exhausted body. This should have been a moment of relief, but it wasn't. Her mind refused to shut off. Every time her eyelids closed, the scene replayed in her mind. Alexander opening the car door, grabbing her wheelchair, tossing it onto the ground along with the suitcase. "I can't carry this weight anymore," he had said. Emily turned to her side, trying to push the memory away. The silence in the house was different from what she was used to. There were no distant sounds of traffic from Chicago, no heavy footsteps of Alexander across their apartment. What she heard now was the wind rustling through the trees, a few distant dogs barking, and somewhere in the house the creak of old wood. She shut her eyes, hoping for sleep, but it didn't come. She woke up a short time later. Her heart was racing, as though she had just had a nightmare, though she couldn't recall any specific dream. She turned in bed, taking a deep breath, trying to relax. But a few minutes later, sleep slipped away again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Was Alexander sleeping now? Did he feel any guilt for what he had done? Did he look over at her side of the bed and realize she wasn't there anymore? Or had he simply moved on, relieved to be free of her? The night dragged on slowly, and Emily woke up several times. The discomfort of being in an unfamiliar place, the uncertainty of the future, all mixed together, making true rest impossible. When the first rays of sunlight began to peek through the window, she gave up on trying to sleep. With a sigh, she struggled to sit up and transferred herself into her wheelchair. Her hands gripped the wheels, pushing herself slowly through the room. The wooden floor creaked beneath the wheels. The bedroom door was slightly open, and Emily caught a faint, comforting scent wafting from the kitchen, something warm, mixed with spices. She moved carefully down the narrow hallway and into the kitchen. Ethan stood with his back to her, stirring something in a clay pot on the stove. The familiar aroma of coffee filled the air, reminding her of simpler times. He turned when he sensed her presence, offering her a quiet smile. "Good morning," he said, pouring coffee into a glass cup. Emily nodded in response, but didn't say anything. The weight in her chest made every word feel impossible. Ethan didn't push her. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, giving her space to approach. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Emily lowered her gaze, staring at the slightly faded tablecloth. "Not really," she murmured. Ethan didn't seem surprised. "Of course, it's a lot to process." She nodded but didn't respond further. The coffee grew cold in front of her, untouched. The silence lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the absence of words that Emily couldn't bring herself to speak. After a few minutes, she attempted to move around the kitchen, but soon realized something she hadn't thought of the night before. The house wasn't exactly built for someone like her. The spaces were too narrow. The chairs and the table made it difficult to move, and the worst part was the door that led to the backyard. There was a step too high for her to manage on her own. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just the house. It was the feeling that nothing would work. Not here, not anywhere. She tried to move again, but bumped the wheel of her chair against one of the corners of the table. The noise echoed through the kitchen, and the frustration that had been building inside her exploded. "I can't live here." Her voice shook, heavy with exhaustion and anger. "I can't live anywhere." The silence that followed was thick. Ethan didn't immediately react. He just watched her with attention, letting her feel everything she needed to feel. Then, calmly, he spoke. "It may not be easy, but you're not alone." Emily blinked a few times, surprised by the simplicity of his words. Days passed slowly, and Emily remained trapped in a state of numbness. Since Alexander abandoned her, her world felt suspended, as if her life had become an empty space between what was and what might be. Ethan had welcomed her without asking questions or pressuring her, but he knew that eventually she would need to face her future. During breakfast, he watched her absent-mindedly stir the spoon in her cup without really drinking the coffee. Her vacant expression made it clear that she was lost in dark thoughts. He broke the silence by suggesting that she start thinking about what she would do next. Emily didn't respond immediately, but the idea echoed in her mind. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, but the mere thought of rebuilding her life was terrifying. Before meeting Alexander, she had worked as a graphic designer and had enjoyed it. However, over the course of their marriage, she had been encouraged to let go of her career. First, she reduced her workload. Then, she stopped taking on new clients. By the time she realized it, she wasn't working at all. Alexander had insisted it was better this way, that she didn't need to worry about money, that he would take care of everything. Now, she found herself without a home, without a husband, and without a path forward. Later that day, Ethan decided it was time to take the first step. He grabbed the keys to his truck and invited Emily to go out. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. As they drove through the narrow, bustling streets of Springfield, she felt disconnected from the life that pulsed around her. The vibrant colors of the facades, the smells of street food, the buzz of merchants, it all seemed part of a world she no longer belonged to. Ethan parked in front of a small corner cafe with an old, weathered sign that read, "Café El Milagro." The place was simple but cozy. He led her inside, where the air was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread. Behind the counter, an older man with graying hair and a calm demeanor greeted them with familiarity. Ethan explained that Don Michael, the cafe owner, needed help with the administrative side of the business and with promoting it online. His son, who had previously handled these tasks, had moved to Denver, and Don Michael had been struggling to keep the finances organized and engage the clientele on social media. Emily listened in silence, feeling the weight of the suggestion. Work again? After so long? Her insecurities screamed inside her. She didn't see herself as a professional anymore, as someone capable of anything. Michael sensed her hesitation, but didn't push her. He said she could try it out, no strings attached. If she liked it, they could discuss something more permanent. Emily stood still for a moment, considering the offer. Her first instinct was to refuse, to say she wasn't ready, that she couldn't do it. But part of her knew that if she turned it down now, she would remain trapped in her fear and inertia. Taking a deep breath, she accepted the opportunity. As they left the cafe, Emily felt a nervous knot in her stomach. Doubts and fears lingered, but for the first time since everything fell apart, something inside her felt different. It wasn't happiness or absolute confidence, it was just a spark. But that was enough to begin. That morning, as Emily arrived at Café El Milagro for her first day of work, a tight knot settled in her stomach. The place was already buzzing with activity, customers coming in and out, the rich smell of coffee mingling with the sweet scent of freshly baked bread. Behind the counter, Don Michael was organizing orders while one of the employees served the tables. Everything seemed to move in a frenetic rhythm, and Emily wondered if she would be able to keep up. She took a deep breath before entering. She didn't know yet if this would work, but she couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. Don Michael greeted her with a nod and pointed to a small office in the back of the cafe. The space was cramped and cluttered with disorganized papers, stacks of invoices with no clear order, and an old computer that had clearly seen better days. "Here's your kingdom," he joked, pulling out a chair for her. Emily glanced around, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. Ethan had given her a chance, but now it was up to her to prove she could still handle it. In the first few minutes, everything seemed chaotic. The accounts didn't match, the records were incomplete, and the cafe's online presence was almost non-existent. The social media page was outdated, with no interaction from customers. She wondered how Don Michael had kept the business running like this for so long. But instead of panicking, she did what she had always done. She broke it down piece by piece. First, the papers. She created a simple system to catalog expenses and profits. Then she tackled the cafe's online page, updating photos, creating promotions, and interacting with customers. Small adjustments that could make a big difference. As she worked, she noticed the curious glances she received. Some customers passing by the office cast quick, puzzled looks her way, as if trying to figure out what she was doing there. But it wasn't the customers that bothered her. From across the counter, Grace, one of the cafe's employees, whispered something to a colleague. Emily didn't need to strain to hear. How's she going to manage? Look at her situation. The words stung, but Emily had been expecting something like this. Since Ethan had brought her here, she knew she would face resistance. People saw her wheelchair before they saw her abilities. She could ignore it, pretend she hadn't heard, but she was tired of being defined by the limitations others imposed on her. Without looking up from the computer screen, she replied calmly but firmly, "The only thing that will stop me from doing a good job is someone doubting me before I even start." The silence that followed was heavy. Grace swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. The colleague awkwardly looked away. Don Michael, who had overheard the conversation from behind the counter, didn't let the comment slide. He called Grace in for a serious talk in the back of the cafe, and after that, she began to keep her distance from Emily. By the end of the day, when the customers had started to thin out and the pace slowed, Don Michael approached. Your work speaks for itself. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time in a long time, someone saw her for her abilities, not her limitations. In the following days, Emily's work began to show results. The cafe's social media page gained engagement, customers commented on the promotions, and sales went up. Small changes that began to make a noticeable difference. For the first time since everything fell apart, Emily felt like she had value again. The days turned into weeks, and gradually Emily's life began to reshape itself. Working at Café El Milagro kept her occupied for most of the day, giving her purpose and, even if momentarily, keeping the shadows of the past at bay. Ethan, always present, took her to and from the cafe every day. At first, their conversations were brief, revolving around small talk, traffic, the weather, some local news. But as the routine settled in, their words started to carry more weight, becoming less superficial. One afternoon, as they were returning home, Emily, gazing out the truck window, broke the sudden silence. "You never talk much about yourself?" Ethan kept his eyes on the road, but a small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "What do you want to know?" She hesitated. Since she had met him, he had been a man of few words, but his presence was constant and reliable. Emily didn't quite know what she was hoping to hear, but she felt there was something there, a story he didn't share easily. "Why do you live alone?" Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a more reserved expression. He took a deep breath before responding. "My wife passed away a few years ago." Emily didn't immediately respond. It explained so much about him. The way he lived quietly, the silence he carried when he was alone. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was hard at first," he continued. "She was everything to me. When she left, I thought I would never have a purpose again." He gripped the steering wheel lightly, as if holding on to keep from drifting into painful memories. "And now? Do you still feel like you have no purpose?" Emily asked softly, her voice laced with curiosity. Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his gaze to the road. "I think helping you has given me one." The unexpected honesty caught Emily off guard. She lowered her eyes, staring at her hands folded in her lap. It had been so long since someone had stood by her side without expecting anything in return. The days continued, and Emily began to notice changes around her. Ethan spent more time at home, often carrying pieces of wood, tools, and nails. At first, she didn't pay much attention, but one evening, as she returned from work, she saw what he had been doing. There, at the entrance of the house, was a newly built ramp. For a moment, Emily froze, staring at the wooden structure, admiring the meticulous details, the care with which each piece had been fitted together. She didn't need to ask to know that Ethan had spent the last few nights building it for her. When he appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands with a cloth he had tucked in his pocket, Emily felt a lump in her throat. "You didn't have to do this for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled, carefree. "And what if I want to?" She didn't know how to respond. For so long, she had been treated as a burden, and the idea of someone simply wanting to help her, without obligation, without expecting anything in return, felt foreign. That night, as she settled into bed, Emily found herself thinking about Ethan in a different light. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper. For the first time since she had been abandoned, she didn't feel entirely alone. It was a busy day at Café El Milagro, with customers coming and going, the strong aroma of coffee blending with the sound of conversation and the clinking of cups. Emily was absorbed in her work in the small office at the back, reviewing orders and updating the cafe's social media accounts. Her efforts were starting to pay off, and Don Michael had already noticed the increase in customer traffic. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was building something of her own. Then the bell above the door rang. It was a small sound, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about it made Emily's stomach twist. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she instinctively looked toward the door. Her body froze when she saw Alexander standing there, just inside the entrance. He looked different, thinner, more tired. The features that had once carried arrogance now seemed worn, and there was something almost hesitant about him. His eyes, which had always watched her with superiority, now seemed to search for something in her, a forgiveness he might never find. Emily didn't look away, but her expression remained blank. The initial shock faded quickly, replaced by a cold detachment. She didn't feel fear anymore, nor did she feel the submission that had once made her accept everything he did without question. Alexander moved toward her, and even before he opened his mouth, Emily knew what he would say. Empty words, justifications without weight. He would try to explain that he regretted his actions, that he had acted impulsively, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. But nothing he could say would change what had happened. Nothing could undo the moment when he left her by the side of the road. She remained silent as he spoke, her arms crossed over her chest, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't worth it to engage. He was the same man, believing that words could fix the irreparable. When Alexander pulled an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table, Emily immediately knew what it was. He was trying to buy her redemption. Her gaze flicked to the paper for a moment before she looked away and let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. He still thought everything could be solved with money, that he could erase the past with a few numbers in a bank account. But what she had needed from him could never be bought. Without hesitation, she pushed the envelope back toward him. Her message was clear. Alexander lowered his head, defeated. For the first time, he seemed to understand that he had lost something he couldn't reclaim. Without another word, he took the envelope and turned to leave. Emily watched him cross the threshold and disappear into the busy street. Something inside her shifted in that moment. There was no anger, no pain, no emptiness. There was only freedom. Her work at Café El Milagro was flourishing. Her routine with Ethan had become a comforting constant. And little by little, Emily began to see a future where her life wasn't defined by abandonment. But despite the parts of herself she had reclaimed, something was still missing, an essential piece that for years had remained forgotten. One afternoon, while tidying up the small room Ethan had offered her, Emily discovered an old box tucked away in the back of the wardrobe. The lid was dusty, the cardboard worn from age. Curiosity piqued. She pulled the box closer, and as she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Paintbrushes, tubes of paint hardened from neglect, sketchbooks filled with unfinished drawings. Her past as an artist was right there, in front of her eyes. Before Alexander, before the marriage that caused her to lose herself, painting had been her true passion. She spent hours mixing colors, creating worlds on canvas, turning emotions into shapes and textures. But Alexander had never seen value in it. To him, painting was a childish hobby with no future, something that didn't fit the life he envisioned for them. Slowly, she let the art fade, until it disappeared completely. Emily held one of the brushes, feeling its smooth wood between her fingers. Could she still do it? Could her art still exist inside her? The doubt lingered as she set up a small, makeshift space in the room. She spread old newspapers on the floor and found a blank canvas tucked away at the bottom of the box. The smell of mixed paints was like a breath of fresh air, a bridge to a part of herself that had been trapped in the past. When she dipped the brush in the paint and began to glide it across the canvas, her hands trembled. The first strokes were uncertain, awkward. The familiarity of the motion was there, but the fear of failure made her hesitate. But then something changed. As the colors blended, an overwhelming wave of emotion overtook her. Each brushstroke felt like releasing an invisible weight, as if she were putting out into the world feelings she had never been able to express in words. Art had never abandoned her. It had just waited patiently for her return. Hours passed without her noticing. When Ethan knocked softly on the door and entered, he stopped in his tracks when he saw her, brush in hand, surrounded by vibrant colors and a look of deep concentration. For a moment, he just watched. Then he slowly approached, inspecting the canvas. "You have incredible talent," he said, genuinely. Emily turned her gaze from the painting, blushing slightly. She didn't know how to react to the compliment. Painting had always been something intimate, something she did for herself, not for others. Ethan, however, seemed to see more than just a dormant talent. He saw history in every stroke, pain and overcoming in every blend of color. "You should show this to the world," he suggested. Emily frowned, unsure. Show? To who? Who would care about her art? Ethan, noticing her hesitation, mentioned a small gallery in downtown Springfield that featured emerging artists. The owner was a friend of his, someone who supported new voices in the art world. She laughed nervously. "I don't know. It's been so long." But Ethan simply smiled, as if he already knew the decision would come from her, in her own time. His words lingered in her mind in the days that followed. The idea of displaying her art was terrifying, but at the same time, intriguing. Every painting she produced seemed to tell a part of her journey, the pain, the abandonment, the rediscovery. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe her story needed to be shared. For the first time, Emily began to consider the possibility of taking a new step. Emily had never imagined that she would paint again, much less that anyone beyond herself would ever see value in her work. But ever since she found the forgotten brushes and paints at the bottom of a box, something inside her had stirred. The time spent in front of the canvas wasn't just a distraction or a pastime. Every brushstroke was a liberation, a piece of her history finally finding its voice. The small room Ethan had offered her slowly transformed into an impromptu studio. Canvases leaned against the walls, tubes of paint scattered across the table, and brushes submerged in jars of water. For hours, Emily lost herself in that world of color where no pain existed, only the need to express everything she felt. Ethan watched from a distance, never interrupting, but always present. He saw in her strokes a strength that perhaps even Emily hadn't realized she had. Emily painted with her soul, and every canvas was a fragment of the woman she was becoming. Don Michael also noticed Emily's talent and had an idea. One afternoon, as he closed out the cash register at the cafe, he took one of the paintings Emily had left on the counter and, without her knowing, hung it on the main wall of the establishment. It was an intense piece, with bold strokes and vibrant colors, conveying a mixture of melancholy and hope. He wanted to see how people would react. That same evening, while Emily was working in the back office, a customer stopped to stare at the painting. The man, a tourist passing through Springfield, asked who the artist was. Don Michael, with a discreet gesture, pointed to Emily, who didn't notice what had happened until she heard the surprised voice behind her. "I'd like to buy it." Emily froze. For a moment she thought she had misheard. Her heart raced and her hands, trembling, gripped the edge of the table. Buy it? Her painting? Someone actually wanted to pay for something she created? She hesitated before walking out of the office, as if any movement might undo this improbable reality. Don Michael smiled to himself, satisfied with the surprise he had prepared for her. "Your art has value, Emily," he said gently. The customer, without hesitation, paid for the painting. When the money was placed in Emily's hands, a strange mix of emotions overwhelmed her. It wasn't just happiness or pride. It was proof that something inside her still held meaning. That night, As Emily sat alone in her room, staring at the folded money in her hands, something changed within her. The sale of the first painting was like a catalyst. With Ethan and Don Michael's encouragement, she dove deeper into her painting. Every new canvas seemed to carry a fragment of her journey, the pain of abandonment, the fear of the unknown, the hope of starting over. She painted as if she were rediscovering herself with each stroke. Ethan, always attentive, observed her progress. One afternoon, while watching her work, he casually mentioned that he knew of a small gallery in the center of Springfield that showcased emerging artists. It was a modest space, but it had a loyal clientele, and the owner was someone who appreciated new talent. Emily hesitated. Painting had always been something personal, something she did for herself. Showing her work meant exposing herself to the judgment of others. But Ethan insisted. He told her that her art wasn't just beautiful images. It was a story told through colors and shapes, stories that needed to be shared. For days, Emily considered the idea. The mere thought of exhibiting her paintings terrified her. What if no one liked them? What if her art wasn't enough? But deep inside, something knew that this was a chance to step into a new chapter of her life. With Ethan's support, she selected her best works and began preparing for the exhibition. It was a meticulous process, choosing the right pieces, adjusting details, writing descriptions. Every decision made her more anxious, but also more determined. The night before the event, however, self-doubt crept in. As she stared at the paintings stacked on the floor of her room, the weight of her insecurities pressed down on her. What if no one came? What if her art wasn't good enough? Ethan noticed her restlessness and sat beside her, silent for a moment before speaking. "It's not about them, Emily. It's about you." She took a deep breath. Looking at her paintings, she realized he was right. She didn't need anyone else's approval. The true victory had already occurred. She believed in herself again, and that was all that mattered. The night of the exhibition arrived faster than Emily had anticipated. The weeks she had spent organizing her paintings, choosing each piece with Ethan's help, now felt like a distant blur. For weeks she had worked tirelessly, adjusting colors, textures, and expressions, trying to find the balance between her emotions and her art. Now, everything was ready. And yet, as she looked out the truck window as they neared the gallery, her stomach turned. Ethan drove in silence, respecting the nervous energy Emily was trying to hide. He knew this moment meant more than just an exhibition. It was the first time Emily was allowing herself to truly be seen, not just her paintings, but her journey. The gallery was located in downtown Springfield, in an understated building with high windows and clean lines. When they arrived, there was already a buzz coming from inside. People were entering and exiting, wine glasses in hand, chatting in small groups, and admiring the displayed works. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment intensify. Ethan parked and turned to her before turning off the engine. His calm gaze met hers, reassuring her without a word. "You're ready," he said. Emily took a deep breath and nodded. She might never feel completely ready, but she had come too far to turn back now. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the sounds and voices of the gallery blurred into the background. The environment was elegant, yet unpretentious. The white walls and carefully positioned lighting brought her paintings to life, highlighting the colors, textures, and emotions in each piece. Her art was no longer just hers. It was something that belonged to the world. She moved slowly through the space, observing the reactions. Some visitors paused in front of her works, silently examining every detail, while others murmured about the emotions captured in the brushstrokes. A couple pointed at one of the paintings, discussing what they thought it represented, trying to decipher the hidden meaning in the composition. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. For the first time, she realized that her art had an impact. It wasn't just an expression of her pain and struggles. It was something that now belonged to others, something that spoke to them too. In one corner of the gallery, Don Michael was chatting animatedly with a group of customers. Since Emily started working at the cafe, he had become one of her biggest supporters, and seeing him there, proud of her, only reinforced the feeling that she was exactly where she needed to be. Ethan, as always, stayed at a distance, watching her with a small, approving smile. He had been there every step of the way, from the moment he found her on the road to this very moment when she finally took ownership of her story. For a brief moment, Emily locked eyes with him across the room. There were no words needed. He knew exactly what this meant to her. But then something made her freeze. Among the crowd, a familiar face appeared. Alexander. Her heart stopped for a moment. She hadn't expected to see him here, not at this moment. He stood near the entrance, motionless, as if he had just arrived. He wore his usual impeccable suit, but his expression was different, no longer full of arrogance. Emily stood still. In the past, just seeing him would have been enough to make her crumble. He was the man who had reduced her to nothing, who had abandoned her without hesitation. But now, as she stood there, watching him, something within her had shifted. Alexander didn't move toward her. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. It was impossible to tell whether he felt pride, regret, or just curiosity. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Emily didn't look away. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide. She simply stood there, looking directly at him until slowly he seemed to understand something. His posture softened and his gaze turned distant. Then, without saying a word, Alexander turned and disappeared into the crowd. Emily exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. It was the end of a chapter. Her attention returned to the paintings around her. Each piece was a fragment of her journey, but now they meant something else. They were not just memories of what she had lived, but representations of everything she had overcome. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The woman who had been abandoned on the side of the road no longer existed. Now she was the author of her own destiny. The night went on, and as the event continued, Emily felt her confidence grow. With each conversation, each sincere compliment about her work, she realized that her art had found its place in the world. The exhibition had been a success beyond what Emily had dared to imagine. As the night went on and the guests began to leave, she still tried to absorb everything that had happened. Her paintings were not just looked at, they were felt, discussed, admired. For the first time, she felt that her story had found a way to connect with the world, not just as a reminder of pain, but as a message of transformation. She was talking to Don Michael and Ethan when a tall man in a grey suit with an analytical gaze approached. His gestures were restrained, but there was a glimmer of genuine interest in his eyes. Emily noticed that he had been at the exhibition since early on, observing her paintings closely. "Señorita Emily, my impression has not changed since the moment I saw your work," he began, with a calm but firm tone. "Your art carries something that cannot be learned. Truth." Emily swallowed hard, not quite sure what to say. The man handed her a business card, and only when she read his name did she realize who he was. James Miller, one of the most respected art curators in Chicago. She held her breath. "Your expressiveness is rare. What you convey in your paintings needs to be seen by more people. I'm organizing a group exhibition in the capital, and I believe your work should be there." The invitation was direct, without preamble, but it left her speechless. Chicago, a bigger exhibition, an audience far beyond what she had ever imagined reaching. Don Michael's eyes gleamed with pride. Ethan, beside her, remained silent, simply waiting for her reaction. But Emily felt a flutter in her stomach. She had always painted because she needed to, because her soul demanded it. But was she really ready for something so big? James continued speaking about the exhibition details, explaining that it would be a high-visibility event, gathering emerging artists alongside established names. It was a rare chance, something that could change her path forever. "I know it may seem intimidating, but opportunities like this don't come around every day," he concluded, handing her the card. "Think about it. I look forward to your answer soon." And then he walked away, leaving her there, motionless, with the piece of paper between her fingers. As soon as the curator left, Don Michael was the first to react. "You have to accept, Emily," he said, excited. "This is huge!" She took a deep breath, trying to process. "I don't know. It's a step too big. What if I'm not ready?" Ethan finally spoke up. "Tú mereces esto. No dejes que el miedo decida por ti." That phrase hit deeply. Fear had always held her back. It was fear that made her accept Alexander's dependence, fear that made her believe for so long that there was nothing left for her beyond what she had already lost. But what if now was different? That night, Emily barely slept. James Miller's card remained by her bed, a constant reminder of the choice she needed to make. The next morning brought an inevitable decision. With the support of Ethan and Don Michael, Emily accepted the invitation. The trip to Chicago wasn't just about the exhibition. It was a definitive new beginning, a step toward a future that, until recently, she hadn't even dared to imagine. The journey to Chicago was unlike anything Emily had ever experienced. The landscape changed quickly through the truck window, and with it, her mind filled with thoughts of everything that was to come. In the past few months, her life had taken a turn she never would have imagined. She had gone from an abandoned woman on the edge of a road to someone now invited to showcase her art in one of the largest galleries in the capital. It was surreal. Ethan drove in silence, respecting the unease that had settled within her since they accepted James Miller's invitation. Beside her, Don Michael fiddled with the radio, excited about the trip. For him, the exhibition was an important event, a celebration of Emily's talent. For her, it was more than that. It was the confirmation that she had overcome the past and found a new purpose. When they arrived at the gallery, Emily felt a shiver run through her body. The building was imposing, with modern architecture and glass walls reflecting the city lights. Inside, preparations were already underway. Assistants were adjusting the spotlights, curators were organizing the last descriptive plaques, and a small group of early guests were already circulating the space, analyzing the works on display. Emily hesitated for a second before entering. She was not just another spectator. Her paintings were there. Her name was there. As she crossed the main hall, her heart raced when she saw her works carefully arranged in a prominent section. Each canvas carried a piece of her story, moments translated into shapes and colors. There were the brushstrokes born from pain, fear, and uncertainty, but also from overcoming. And now, people were observing it with genuine interest. Some art critics were examining the paintings closely, discussing the expressiveness and technique. A journalist was taking notes, and a photographer was adjusting the angle to capture the works under perfect lighting. Emily felt a lump in her throat. For so long she had doubted herself. Now she was there, being recognized not for what she had lost, but for what she had built. Don Michael watched everything with an undeniable pride. Ethan, as always, stood by her, making sure she knew she wasn't alone, but without stealing the spotlight from her. Emily didn't need words to understand what he was saying with that calm gaze. As the night went on, she moved away from the bustle and walked toward one of the paintings on display. It was one of her early works, made when she still didn't quite know what she was searching for. The canvas displayed intense strokes, colors blended in an almost chaotic expression, as if the past and present were trying to meet. She stood there, alone before her own art, allowing herself to feel each part of that journey. If she could go back in time and meet the woman Alexander abandoned on that deserted road, what would she say to her? Perhaps she would tell her that the pain wouldn't last forever, that the open wounds would one day become marks of a battle won. That all of it would make sense, but above all, she would tell her that she was never a burden, that her worth was never in anyone's hands, but her own. Emily smiled softly. For the first time, she no longer felt that her life was an unfinished draft. Her destiny was no longer in someone else's hands. Now, she was the artist of her own story. The exhibition in Chicago surpassed every expectation Emily had. In the first few hours of the event, she could already feel the shift. Her paintings were being admired, discussed, and most unexpectedly bought. Collectors were fascinated by her expressiveness, and critics praised the emotional depth of her work. These weren't just paintings, they were living stories, fragments of her soul transformed into color. Over the course of the week, the buzz only grew. The local press began to feature her, highlighting her remarkable journey of overcoming hardship and the power behind her art. Interviews were scheduled, and articles appeared in both newspapers and art magazines. For someone who, just months ago, believed she had no future, this felt like an impossible dream coming to life. Despite all the excitement around her, Emily remained quiet and reserved. She had never sought fame or recognition. She simply wanted a way to give voice to everything she had lived. But seeing so many people connect with her story made her realize that her art went beyond her own experience. On the final day of the exhibition, while she was talking with some visitors and thanking everyone who had supported her, a man in his mid-40s approached. His well-tailored suit and confident demeanor made it clear that he wasn't just an ordinary attendee. He waited politely for her conversation to end before introducing himself. "Emily, my name is William Davis," he said, extending his hand. "I work with cultural development projects and have been following your growth over the past few weeks. Your story and your art have deeply impressed me." She thanked him, still unsure of what this conversation would lead to. William smiled and continued, "I want to make you a proposal." The word proposal caught her attention. He went on to explain that he had worked in the art sector for years, helping to fund innovative cultural initiatives. His company supported emerging artists. But what intrigued him most about Emily was not just her talent, but the impact her art could have. "I don't know if you've thought about it, but your journey could inspire others who, like you, face daily challenges. And art can be a way for them to express themselves and find independence, just as you did." Emily listened attentively. "I want to sponsor a studio for you, a space that's accessible, where you can not only create, but also teach. A place where people with disabilities can find a form of expression and independence through art, just as you did." The offer took her completely by surprise. A studio of her own? The idea had never even crossed her mind. She had always seen painting as something personal, something she did for herself. But what if she could help others find themselves through art, just as she had? Her gaze turned to Ethan, who had been observing the conversation from a distance. He smiled lightly, as though he already knew this moment was coming. Emily hesitated. The fear began to creep in once more, reminding her of all the things she once believed she couldn't do. But something inside her, something new and strong, told her this was an opportunity she couldn't let slip by. William, sensing her uncertainty, added, "Think it over. There's no rush. But know that your talent has already changed your life. Now, it can change the lives of many others." That night, Emily sat alone in her room, looking at her paint-stained hands, reflecting on everything that had led her here. She had gone from a moment of absolute despair to a life she never imagined for herself. Now, She was facing a future that went beyond her own journey, and for the first time, she felt ready to embrace it. The proposal from William Davis was everything Emily had never dreamed she could have. A fully funded studio, a space where she could create and teach, helping others find a form of expression and healing through art. For days, she pondered the idea, weighing the possibilities and considering what that decision would mean for her future. Chicago offered a world of opportunities, exhibitions, connections, visibility. It was a new beginning in a completely different setting, one where she could solidify her career in ways she had never imagined. But as tempting as the invitation was, something deep inside her hesitated. Since leaving the capital months ago, her life had taken an unexpected turn. In Springfield, she had found more than just a temporary refuge. She had found purpose, friendship, and, most importantly, herself. Here she had rebuilt her dignity, learned to trust again, and above all, realized that her story didn't need to be written in the mold others imposed on her. This was where she wanted to be. The decision came quietly, but with unwavering certainty. It wasn't just a professional choice, it was an act of belonging. The studio wouldn't open in Chicago, but in Springfield, where her new life had begun. When she told William her decision, he regarded her for a moment, weighing her words. Then he smiled. "You know exactly where you belong," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "And that's what makes you a true artist." With that, the preparations for the studio began. Emily threw herself into the project, selecting a space that could be adapted to welcome students with varying needs. The place wouldn't just be an art studio, it would be a sanctuary for those who, like her, needed to rediscover their worth. In the midst of it all, Emily realized something she'd been trying to ignore. Ethan had always been by her side. From the moment he found her on the road until now, he had never hesitated to support her. He encouraged her to move forward when she couldn't believe in herself. He made adjustments to his home to make it more accessible without her ever having to ask. He had seen a strength in her that she couldn't even see in herself. And Emily, so focused on rebuilding herself, was only now beginning to understand what Ethan truly meant to her. Over the past few months, he had become more than just a friend. He had become her foundation, her rock, the safe harbor she never thought she would have again. One quiet afternoon, as they were returning from a meeting about the studio, Emily finally allowed the feeling to take shape. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting golden hues across the road. The truck moved at a slow pace, rocking them gently in comfortable silence. Emily, glancing at Ethan behind the wheel, felt a peace she had never known with Alexander. He noticed her gaze and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" She paused for a moment before answering. "About how everything has changed." He nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the warm breeze through the window. For the first time, her heart felt light. Her past was no longer a burden, and her future didn't seem uncertain. She knew exactly who she was and where she wanted to be. Ethan slowed the truck, glancing at her longer than necessary. In his eyes there was no rush, just the certainty that when Emily was ready, he would be there. And in that moment she realized she already was. With a smile that carried the full weight of her newfound freedom, Emily intertwined her fingers with his. Now, as the owner of her own destiny, she felt no fear. Her past did not define her. Her future had just begun.